Well, we have a treat having Trevin Wax with us today. Huge thanks to the C.S. Lewis Institute of Atlanta for helping bring Trevin in. If you're unfamiliar with the C.S. Lewis Institute, their mission is discipleship of heart, mind, and through events, programs, and resources. They like to partner alongside local churches to strengthen in those areas, and so we're super thankful for helping get Trevin in with us today. If you're unfamiliar with Trevin Wax, Trevin is the Vice President of Research and Resource Development at North American Mission Board. That is a mouthful. It sounds important, though. He's also a visiting professor at Cedarville University and author. Would you guys please welcome Trevin Wax to the platform?
Thanks very much, Ryan. So, thank you all for being here and for participating. And it's always a challenge when you get the after lunch session when we just had our bowl of hopefully mainly protein, chips maybe as well. But what I want to do in the time that we've got today is I want to zero in on the question that I think will help us as we think about our current situation as missionaries with a missionary mindset of why it's hard to do evangelism. And not just difficult sometimes for us to engage in evangelism as church leaders, as people who want to be telling others of the good news, but also why it's hard to get people in our congregations really motivated about sharing the gospel. And what are some reasons why, in the North American context in particular, this can be a challenge, not only for ourselves, but also for the people that we're called to lead. And I think the hopefully what I present today will give you some cultural insight going back centuries as to why we've arrived, how we've arrived at this moment. And then I also want to offer some suggestions, some things to be thinking about as we, some practical things as well as we move forward. So to kind of sum up where we are culturally, whenever you overhear conversations that touch on something spiritual or deal with something related to religion, if you listen carefully, a lot of times you're going to hear two words come up. For me. You hear that a lot. As soon as the discussion takes a turn toward claims about truth and falsehood, these two words, for me, they rush in like a bomb squad diffusing a stick of dynamite, Well, for me, there is a God. And just believing in him just feels right. Well, for me, that's a sin. Or in my experience, for me, Jesus is the best path to God. Or for me, this is what the Bible says, right? In the introduction of those two words, for me, you ask, why do we hear those words so much? It's because they serve to immediately personalize and privatize whatever claim you're making. And so there's a reason why we rush to those words. Now, obviously, it's not wrong to personalize and relativize an issue. If my wife is asking me a question about a particular outfit that she's bought and she wants to know if I like this one or that one, it's totally fine for me to say, well, for me, this one really accentuates the beauty of your eyes, or so, to have like a preference when you're talking in the realm of personal preference. Or if I'm with my team, and we're talking about strategies for, getting the word out about some of our church planters or our disaster relief or whatnot. We're debating marketing strategies, resource strategies around the table. It's totally appropriate for me in that context, in a boardroom kind of context, to want to say, well, for me, I think we ought to go this way, because what I'm doing is I'm saying this is my perspective. It's not necessarily objectively true. This is just the way I see this. It's a signal that I'm sharing a subjective opinion. But that's different when we talk about those situations, when we compare those two conversations about the existence of God, the claims of Christ, the truth of the gospel. When we add those words, for me, into those conversations so that they personalize or they relativize whatever we're saying, we're not recognizing that when it comes to the gospel, we are in the realm of truth versus falsehood, orthodoxy and heresy, sin and righteousness. We're not just making a claim that is for me, true for me. We're saying something that we believe to be true about the world, something that is objectively true. I mean, can you imagine how Thomas Aquinas or Martin Luther would have responded if I said to them, well, for me, Jesus is the only way to God? I just imagine they'd be puzzled and they'd be like, well, of course for you, Jesus is the only way to God, because he's the only way to God for everybody, not just for you, right? And if you double down, it's like, yeah, but for me, this is the truth. I just think they would find it puzzling and strange that you would personalize a claim in that way. Those two words, for me, when spoken in the wrong way at the wrong time, they soften the truth claim and they make it a matter of personal belief. So there's a big difference between, like, obviously, when we're thinking about Aquinas or Luther, we're going back 500 years, 700, we're going back centuries. There's a difference between how they would have used that word and how we use that word. Today, we often hear people celebrating the importance of speaking my truth, right? Living my truth. And in these cases, what you notice, if you listen carefully, the notion of objective truth is now being equated with someone's subjective perspective. Because that's what they mean. When someone says, I need to speak my truth, what they mean is, I need to speak honestly about what I've experienced. And that's a good thing, right? Like, we should welcome that. We shouldn't just shut someone down when they say, I need to speak my truth. What they mean is, I need to speak my perspective. And we should speak truthfully about our experiences. But when we're talking about the gospel or matters related to religion, spirituality, if we always surround the word truth with adjectives like my and your, we never get around to making a truth claim like this is the truth. We're actually shrinking back from the New Testament command to spread the gospel as an objective, publicly accessible truth that is true for everyone in the whole world. It's not just one subjective opinion or perspective that's a viable option among many other people. So what I want to do in this session is I want us to take a closer look at this development. Like, how did we get here? Why is that affecting our Christian mission, especially evangelism in the West? When we talk about Jesus, when we present the gospel, what we have to understand as good missionaries in the North American context is, as soon as you start talking about the gospel, most people are going to assume you are talking about a private and personalized faith that works for you. Kind of like you're asking them to adopt the same hobby you've got. That's how they will interpret you. That you're just speaking your truth, right? Or that you're just sharing about the religious identity that works for you. But true evangelism has to go further than that. It's announcing good news that can't be reduced to personal preference or just private spirituality, because at the end of the day, it confronts the listener with a choice. A choice. And that element of confrontation, that presents a challenge in sharing the gospel in our day and age. So how did we get to this point? Why is this the cultural context that we're in? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the Enlightenment. A little bit of historical work here, and I'm going to be speaking in very sweeping terms here, just to move us through the centuries very quickly. But you know this, the philosophical tradition of the 17th and 18th centuries, human reason is the pinnacle of history, right? The implementation of science and technology is going to push us toward this greater future. And this is going to be a very brief overview, but it's important. I mean, you know some of the familiar figures of the Enlightenment period: John Locke, Voltaire, David Hume, Immanuel Kant. In fact, Kant defined the whole project of the Enlightenment with this very well-known paragraph: "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding." That's the motto of the Enlightenment. So notice there's a story being told here, right? With Kant. The problem is dependent ignorance. You're not able to use your own understanding without someone else guiding you. And then notice his solution: independent thought. Have the courage to use your own understanding. So notice that there's a value system that's kind of implicit in here. It's the way of dependent ignorance is the coward's way. The way of independent thought, that's what's courageous. And so those who come after Kant, after the initial batch of Enlightenment thinkers, eventually they begin to apply this to Christianity. The church is getting in the way. That's where you're dependently ignorant. Or to believe Christianity makes you not just cowardly, but also foolish, harmful. And if you're going to wind up minimizing the evil in this world, then you need to either abolish these strong forms of religious truth claims, or you could just pressure people to keep their beliefs confined to their private lives. So either personalize it or privatize it. Now, it's impossible to fully reckon with the influence of the Enlightenment on our society, and there's a lot that is good with that, with the Enlightenment. I don't think we should overlook the benefits of that. I am very glad for many of the technological inventions that came from the Enlightenment. If you're going to be operated on by a doctor today, you better be thankful for Enlightenment knowledge. You know, I, for one, am thankful for many inventions. Air conditioning is a big one. But it is a mixed bag in terms of some of the philosophical entailments that come from this. And those negative aspects of Enlightenment thinking have profoundly influenced our society. And by extension, they do affect the way that we carry out our mission. So I'll just point out a few of these. The first is, when we look at the influence of the Enlightenment, it was this idea that we would find this universal morality that we could ground in human reason. Like, how can we be moral can we be moral? Is there a way to be moral that doesn't have to have a transcendent referent point outside of this present world? How can we establish a moral society without having to rely on divine revelation? And can we make that the basis of universal civilization? That's a big question that was driving those Enlightenment thinkers. And you see the fruit of that in the Declaration of Independence. Andrew Wilson has pointed out an edit of Thomas Jefferson's earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence. One of the earlier drafts said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Ben Franklin scratched out those words and just wrote in self-evident. So this is what Andrew says. He says, Jefferson's version, despite his theological skepticism, presented the equality of men and the rights they held as grounded in religion. They are undeniable because they are sacred truths that originate with the Creator. By contrast, Franklin's version grounded them in reason. They are self-evident truths. They're not dependent on any particular religious tradition, but can easily be grasped as logically necessary by anyone who thinks about them for long enough. You could see something similar to this in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations in 1948. If you read the preamble, it's a great statement, really, but if you read the articles, it's this declaration of humanity's intrinsic dignity as the basis for human rights. I mean, it is a moral vision, if ever there was one. And it is set forth in that Universal Declaration like, this is the vision, and it is normative for every civilization, but there's no appeal to God. There's no appeal to a higher power. And I think that's probably the culmination. It's a terrific example of Enlightenment thought as it's worked out. You've got this passionate pursuit of a universal morality, this universal moral standard, but it's based on human autonomous reason that's independent of God, not divine revelation. In other words, who needs God? We can be successful, we can be moral, we can be happy, we can be fulfilled, virtuous, just fill in the blank, without that transcendent referent point. That is one of the areas where the Enlightenment has influenced us. Another aspect of the Enlightenment's influence is that religion, it opposes religion as the path to growth and knowledge. So it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're trying to establish morality and knowledge apart from divine revelation, then you're going to kind of give the side eye to traditional religious belief. I mean, you may still appreciate Christianity for some of its moral teachings. You may, if you're like David Hume, if you're like some of the other Enlightenment philosophers, you may actually live in a fairly conservative manner, just morally, ethically speaking, just assuming, well, all societies that really think this through are going to just arrive at the same conclusion that we do through rationality and critical thought, and they're going to have similar moral values and whatnot. But for the most part, if you're going to establish universal morality apart from divine revelation, then you've got to challenge society's reliance on religion. You've got to make the break. If you're going to move from revelation to reason, you've got to create some kind of break in between the two. And religion needs to get pushed over into that category of superstition, myth. Enlightenment scholar Peter Gay says, myth could be sympathetically understood. So the Christian faith is an example of that. You could sympathetically understand it, but only after it had been fully conquered. in the course of its conquest, it had to be faced as the enemy. The Enlightenment had to treat religion as superstition and error in order to recognize itself. So you say, okay, well, that's interesting, but what's the effect of all of that? Well, in secular schools, universities, what's the common assumption? That we're going to find ourselves on the road of greater heights of human knowledge. While we're walking that road, we're going to shed the silly superstitions and religions of the past, any reliance on supernatural revelation. I mean, in most secular university settings, God is an afterthought, if he'd be mentioned even at all. Because the idea is that knowledge is separate from that. Why? Because that break has happened. Religion may be helpful, may be nice, but as a way of thinking about the world and about what's true and about knowledge, it gets in the way. It's actually an obstacle. Now, I wouldn't want to give the impression, though, that that means that, oh, well, the Enlightenment progresses as religion declines. That hasn't happened in the United States in quite that way. Charles Taylor talks about how secularity doesn't come as a result of just this steady, erosion of religious faith. What he would define secularity as the kind of society where faith is no longer the default. It's no longer axiomatic. Like, what's changed is not that people don't believe anymore, but that a lot of people, most people even, view unbelief as a legitimate option. And I think it's important to note that complexity there, because that means that we're not in some zero-sum game where, religion fails as reason wins. Actually, both religion and reason win and lose simultaneously. Religious people today entertain doubts that their forefathers would have never wondered about, simply because we live in a society that is marked by unbelief. Unbelief is prevalent in our society. But likewise, non-religious people entertain doubts about their doubts. They wonder about transcendence. They can be just as haunted by their losses. It's like how Julian Barnes' book on death begins. I don't believe in God, and I miss him. So here's the key point for our present purposes, and we'll move on from here. Once faith is no longer axiomatic, once that's not the default, what happens is reason and science rush in as these allegedly objective referees, right? It's reason and science that are going to be the referees in all sorts of disputes. And that leads to the split. You've probably heard it before, the fact and value split, right? The split between facts and values. Values are subjective. Morality is an invention, or it's something that we just use to help society cohere. But science is objective, right? Facts, that's indisputable. And so Christianity gets put in that value category. It gets reduced to just private beliefs, values, and if the church, if you want to flourish as like a little subculture for people who wish to be into that sort of thing, that's great. But it really doesn't have any basis of speaking to what's happening on the ground, in other spheres of life. So religion is just it's a personal matter. It may be intimate, may be really important to you personally, but it's not something that could be brought out in in a public way. So it may be true for you in that it gives you meaning, gives you purpose, makes you happier. It could be true for me, but it's not true, like in the objective sense of the word. It's not the truth about our world. So that's where this Enlightenment influence then takes us. But then if you kind of pull this together, so you combine the pursuit of justifying morality, apart from revelation. You take that, and then you take the number two thing, it's opposition toward traditional religion. You got a third characteristic that's really important for the meaning crisis that we face in our society today. There is a shift in the foundation of moral theory that leaves humanity without a telos, without a shared end. There's no shared goal anymore. Because you lose that transcendent framework for understanding human nature or meaning or the purpose of life. You know what that means? It sounds really amazing and freeing. It means you've got to create that for yourself. What's the goal of life? Well, you tell me for yourself what is the goal of life, right? Which means instead of people assuming we're all kind of moving together, we have this shared end, now it's basically up to everybody to determine this for yourself. And that sounds really freeing, but it actually is experienced as pretty stressful. and exhausting. So society loses that sense of purposefulness. There's no aim that we could strive for. So everybody's got to figure out purpose for themselves. So this is the way it's painted is, oh, it's great. We are liberated from these outmoded forms of social organization. But so what happens is in that act of liberation, the bigger question, not just what you are free from, but what you are free for, that goes unanswered. So in our society today, when people talk about freedom, for the most part, they mean freedom from. We are free now from the past, from superstitions, from religion, from outdated moral teachings, from community formation, from anything that would inhibit us. Notice, so it's from. But what are we free for? Like, what are we free to become? There's no clear answer to that question. And so what happens to religion when society begins to lose sight of what humanity is for? Well, what happens to religious faith is you start to see your faith in terms of its impact on your life, not its overall truthfulness. And this is why so many people today, you'll hear people say, all religions are basically teaching the same thing. A lot of people assume that. Deep down, behind the scenes, or underneath some of the superficial things, all religions are saying the same thing. The only way that you could make a statement like that is especially if you know the differences between the religions, but the only way that you could make that statement is if you believe that the purpose of religion is just to make you a happy, good, moral, and fulfilled person. If you think that's what religion's all about, well then yeah, it makes sense to say that. If it's to better your life, not to tell you the truth about your world, then you can judge a religion based on its usefulness. You are the judge. And so there's this pattern that takes place here. Once you begin to see religion that way, religion just becomes another aspect of the world that you want to master, that you want to control. To make the world controllable that's a word used by the German philosopher Hartmut Rosa, who says that this desire to make the world controllable, it's the driving force of modern life. And this is the path that he says. So first we want to make the world visible, right? Make it knowable, expanding our knowledge of what is there. Then we want to make it physically reachable or accessible. Then we want to make it manageable. And finally, we want to make it useful. We want to press it into service, to make it an instrument for our own purposes. So but the problem is, and what Rosa says, this is one of the reasons people are so unhappy, is that once we do this to the world, once we try to make the world controllable at every level, accessible, manageable, useful, you start to see the world as a series of objects that you are to know, to attain, to conquer, to master, to exploit, and that kills wonder in the world. It leads to what Max Weber said was called disenchantment, right? The experience of feeling alive, of truly encountering the world, Rosa calls it resonance. Like, when you have that moment when something really resonates with you, and you have this resonance, like when you're standing in the middle of a snowstorm that is awe-inspiring in its beauty and yet totally uncontrollable by you, and there's that sense of wonder or awe inside. When you can master everything, you wind up that feeling of really being alive eludes you, and the world becomes this dead thing that we act upon, not something that can call out to us, not something that can lead us to a feeling of wonder and awe. And I bring this up because here's the tendency that we have. This tendency with mastery and controllability doesn't just affect the way we see the world, it affects the way we look at Christianity, the way that we look at our faith, the way many people in our congregations, why they come to church. We start to judge religion based on its usefulness, or how much I can press it into my own, to press it into service for my own purposes. So we'll move on from the Enlightenment. But in summary then, I would just say the Enlightenment's influence on the field that we labor in. It means first, you can't expect faith to be the default option in society. You just can't. Even doubters will be haunted by faith, and the faithful will be haunted by doubts. That's going to happen. So when you call someone to believe, that's complicated because faith is constantly questioned in our society, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing For most people, religion is a personal and a private path chosen from a marketplace of overflowing spiritualities, various spiritualities. It's not something that is objectively true about the world. So again, like I said at the beginning, when you call someone to faith, they're going to assume that you're talking about the realm of values, my truth, your truth, right? Third, we experience the world as disenchanted. We see religion through the lens of pragmatism, whatever works, right? Something that we could instrumentalize for our own purposes. So that's the Enlightenment's influence. Now, so how do we meet that challenge? How do we meet the challenge of a privatized religion? What does all of that mean for the church today? So I'm going to just offer a few suggestions, some thoughts that hopefully will stimulate some fruitful thinking, and then we can talk about these and more, and you might have other suggestions that will make their way into future presentations on this subject of mine. Because I want to hear from you all as well, what you all think are some of the opportunities we have. I feel like I've laid out the challenge pretty succinctly as I can. I want to hear from all of us once we kind of have some back and forth here in a little bit as to other things that you think might be helpful. Some practical, some more at the the more overarching level. The first thing that I would say that is just vitally important for us to keep in mind is we hold out a real encounter with a real God. And I'm going to start here because, I mentioned Max Weber earlier and what he said that we, about the world that we make manageable and predictable, that it loses its magic, its voice, its meaning. He calls it, that phenomenon is disenchantment, right? Well, the answer to a disenchanted world, stripped of its transcendence, is not a disenchanted church. Unfortunately, that has been that's been the approach of a lot of churches. In fact, you want to go back last century, theological liberalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, where they would reduce the scriptures to something less than God's divine revelation. They flattened the Bible out to where it was just a record of human experience of the divine. Well, liberalism just stripped the church of its power. H. Richard Niebuhr's famous, quote, he summed up the result. A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. So that's that. But lest we pick on theological liberals, I think we should just note that there was a pragmatic turn among a lot of conservative evangelicals in the last half century as well. The supernatural getting downplayed in favor of whatever was most practical. This image of a God who seems manageable, he's predictable, he affirms our deepest desires, he offers a sprinkling of transcendence on our lives, blesses all of our endeavors. In some cases, the gospel was instrumentalized for political purpose. So the cross gets moved from the center of Christian proclamation and some kind of social cause gets put in its place. And it may even be a good social cause, but it's a cause, not the cross at the center nonetheless. And so in that situation, you still have churches often that still have an orthodox teaching of God about his revelation, but at the end of the day, on the ground, they've become just basically voluntary associations for social activism. Culture warriors on the right, errand runners for the left. That's what happens. But in contrast to these approaches, the church has got to remember that what we hold out to the world, more than anything else, is not a program for better living. It's not good advice for financial gain. It's not a healthy approach to raising children. It's not a moral anchor for the world. It's not a socially active plan to make the world a better place, eradicate injustice, make a dent in climate change. Listen, Christians may be involved in all of these efforts and more. The one element that is the non-negotiable, indisputable, most necessary element is this: the church holds out a real encounter with a real God. Like, our purpose isn't to share something that works for me. It's to summon the world to worship the only true and living God. It's a real encounter. I mean, can you imagine Moses at the burning bush being told to take off his sandals and saying, well, for me, I don't think God would tell me to take off my shoes. Like it doesn't even make it, like, you can't even imagine that scene. right? Like for me, just is laughable there. Why? Because we realize that in a true encounter with the divine, with God, we are undone. God cannot be controlled. He cannot be mastered. He won't be knocked down to our size. And that's the beauty of the whole thing, is that it's the uncontrollability of God where we find our deepest resonance, right? Now, the tendency of our times wants us to try to control that encounter, to accumulate it somehow, to orchestrate it, to save it, somehow to instrumentalize it for some other purpose, to sort of manufacture an amazing worship experience somehow in which people are going to, have this sort of feeling. But a lot of times, these are the actions that actually deaden a church, because God will not be controllable. He's going to break through that wall of personalized and privatized faith as the great I am. It's interesting to me when Jesus first encounters his future disciples, after John the Baptist, that moment when John the Baptist says, he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. What does Jesus first ask his future disciples? He says, what are you seeking? In other words, what is it you want? Notice he doesn't start with, what do you think? Or what do you say? And see, I think this encounter with God, it begins with the heart. What do you desire? Like what does your wanter want? And I bring this up because I think that the starting point for evangelism in our day should be curiosity. The attentive listening to someone else made in God's image, looking beyond the surface to unearth, like, what are the deepest longings of this person that God has put in front of me? What are those misdirected longings that they keep bumping up against that ceiling of immanence, right? They're unable to break through to the God who is above and outside yet close to us. Christopher Watkin has said that the myth of modernity is the myth that there are no myths. He said the idea of disenchantment is itself an enchantment. The idea of demythologizing is our culture's mythology. And so, if that's true, then that means that the disenchanted world needs a church that can be a prophet, not just a chaplain to a declining culture. A church that is filled with confidence that God is 100% real and has revealed himself. A church that unmasks the attempt to find fullness only in immanent sources rather than transcendent ones. A church that cares about scripture and doctrine, not because we want to win a game of Bible trivia, but because we've encountered the true and living God and we want to worship him and describe him rightly. Because the church's main goal is not workability, it's worship. It's worship. So I start with that. That's the first thing I think we've got that must be said. The second thing is, what works is often going to be our starting point, but it just can't be our ending point. So you've got the reality of God, you've got the objective truth of the gospel in contrast to society's impulse to just privatize our faith. Well, a question then comes up. It seems like, well, okay, there are pastors that have said this. People are not looking to find out what's true. Most people are looking to find out what works or what feels right or what is good to them. And if that's the case, if that's the question most people are asking, how do we proceed with evangelism in that? Well, first of all, that's a great question, but we shouldn't be surprised. C.S. Lewis noted this move to pragmatism 80 years ago. So it's not like this is new. He said this back in 1946. In lecturing to popular audiences, I have repeatedly found it almost impossible to make them understand that I recommended Christianity because I thought its affirmations to be objectively true. They are simply not interested in the question of truth or falsehood. They only want to know if it will be comforting or inspiring or socially useful. I mean, this is C.S. Lewis in 1946. Okay? And I think if that is true of Lewis in his day, then how much more is it true of us in our day? So the question, though, what works or what's useful, what's comforting? Well, that might be your starting point because that's just the nature of the soil in the mission field that we're called to serve in. So, I mean, you all know this. Some of you have trained in apologetics, right? Like you are ready to argue the existence of God, only to find out that a lot of the people we share the gospel with already believe in some kind of God. Like that isn't necessarily the question that they're wrestling with. Some are, but not the majority, right? Most of the time, the questions you're going to have in evangelistically are not about proving the existence of God. It's going to be, how's life working out for you? The way you see the world, the way you live in the world, how is it working out? Discussing whether the Christian life, the Christian vision of life is workable. Or you may be helping them see that Christianity's overall influence on society is positive, not negative. We actually have non-Christians lately who have been helping us with that. So that's a good starting point, but it's not the end goal. You've got to press deeper. And so Lewis would say, well, if you only and always speak of Christianity on the plane of whatever works, and you never get to that truth question, then you're just leaving Christianity without distinctiveness. Like it's just good advice for moral living. This is something else he wrote in Christian Apologetics. He said, one of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity, not because it's true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything, whatever. You have to keep forcing them back and again back to the real point. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. Now, listen, I think if Lewis were here today, he would affirm that Christianity is not only good, and not only true, it is also good, it is also beautiful, and I think he would also say it works. I think he would be happy to meet someone wherever they are in their spiritual understanding. And listen, if at first a discussion of Christianity's beauty or goodness makes the most sense, well, then by all means, let's have that conversation. Start with what works. But we can't stop there. We have to press further. I found this fascinating. There's a recent interview with an environmentalist author, Paul Kingsnorth, who talks about his conversion to Christianity. And he mentions in this interview I was listening to about all these people who kept pointing out the bad track record of the church, okay? And I mean, I think we'd all admit the church oftentimes has had a bad track record. But this is what he says. He says, I didn't want to be a Christian. There's nothing less fashionable than being a Christian in the West. It's the worst thing you can possibly do. Sometimes people send me big emails explaining all the terrible things that the church has done for the last 2,000 years, many of which are true. And they say, how could you be a Christian? And I say, well, look, if it was just a philosophy I'd chosen or something, you'd have a point. But being a Christian is about Christ. And he turns out to be real. And so what do you want me to do with that? I mean, the thing is, Jesus turns out to be real. I mean, you can debate the flaws and the failures, the good and the bad of the church's witness all day long, and Lord knows we have plenty of things we can debate. And you can discuss how Christianity works as a way of life or its impact on society and culture, to the point that even Richard Dawkins is now saying he's a cultural Christian. You can assess its legacy in that way. But if you perpetually delay the truth question, I mean, at the end of the day, we're telling a lie about reality. Just because something works doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's good. And whatever the way you would even judge it on the basis of its working is often a subjective or a personal or short-sighted kind of perspective. So when the time is right, at some point, we've got to plow this trough back to truth. We've got to cut to the heart of the matter. And we have the conversation with someone on this, that when the time is right, true evangelism always gets to the one clear and burning question: who is Jesus Christ? It's Jesus's question. Who do you say that I am? And see, that's where the adventure really starts. So this is the third suggestion I would have here is we're going to have to recapture and reframe and reimagine evangelism as a daring act of subversion. Because listen, even if you have great conversations with someone about how life's working out for them, or at some point, true evangelism is going to get to the point where you call someone to cross from death to life, where you're asking them to pledge allegiance to God, to repent of sin, to trust in Christ, to walk through the baptismal waters where they're renouncing the evil one and all of his deeds. I mean, and that is what is nearly unconscionable in a pluralistic society that thinks religion is only about values and preferences. That's where the adventure is. And it's daring to do this. It's daring for a couple of reasons. First, real evangelism is daring because it says what must not be said. When we're talking about Jesus Christ, we're not talking about my truth and your truth. We are talking about a public announcement that is true for the whole world. And that announcement is very subversive in our day because it takes an axe to the root of the great idol of our day. You know what that idol is? This pluralistic conception that thinks Jesus can be personal Lord and Savior, or he can be king of your heart, or someone who helps you through life, or a great coach, but forbids us to claim that his lordship is objectively true for all people in all places at all times. If you want to know why evangelism is scary, it's because when you get to that point, you are going for the jugular of one of our society's biggest idols. No wonder it's hard. Like, no wonder. I mean, you all, if you've had conversations about Christianity with other people, you know the moment I'm talking about where your heart starts racing a little bit faster. You know, like you can have great conversations over an extended period of time, building relationships also. But when you get to the point, this point here, no wonder we're all like, well, for me, you know, like, because it's like in that moment, like, and so here's the thing. If we as pastors and planters and church leaders, and parachurch, like working in Christian organizations, if we feel the pressure and a little bit of the fright of that moment, how much more do you think the people in our congregations feel that? So like part of what our task is going to have to paint this as an adventure. Like say, hey, if you feel that way, good, because that's the excitement of what it is we're doing. We are taking an axe to that idol in that moment. So that's the first reason why it's daring. The second one is because, I mean, it's just as offensive. I mean, basically, true evangelism is saying that you and I and everyone else are implicated in the murder of God. Like, I just don't know how you can really sugarcoat that. That our sins are on the docket instead of God being on the docket. You know, that he's the one who holds the key to free us from guilt and shame. You know, that we are sinners, that we've fallen short of the glory of God. The reason why that's daring is because most people like to think of their life with themselves as the hero. Like in the movie of every one of our lives, we're like the central character. And few of us really see ourselves as villains, okay? Most of the time, we see ourselves as the hero, and this requires an about face. It requires a turnaround when we really talk about the gospel. But what I'm saying is that there is a God-intended subversiveness to evangelism, and there is something daring about talking about Jesus, who he is, and what he has done. So instead of describing the Christian life as just a religious preference, you know, like, hey, I think you should try this dessert instead of that dessert, you know, when you get to the crux of the matter, what we're saying is Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the one crucified for our sins and now raised from the dead, he is the Messiah of Israel and he's the King of the world. And evangelism is saying, this is the truth about the world. Now bring your life into line with that reality. And the way we bring our lives into line with that announcement is through the cross and resurrection. I love Leslie Newbigin, the missionary theologian who evangelized in this way. He had this great quote. He said, there can be no true evangelism except that which announces what is not only good news, but true news. It is a very serious matter when the gospel is marketed primarily as a panacea for personal or public ills. We believe that it is indeed for the healing of the nations, but it cannot be this if it is not true. So the task of the church is to push through the fear and to tell the truth in love. And I would just say one of the ways that we equip ourselves and other people to do this is we have to have a genuine attentiveness to the person before us. We're not just affirming these truths. There's a way that you could hear everything I'm saying, and you could say, oh, well, then the gospel is true evangelism means we got to be daring, hold that sign, repent or die, Jesus is Lord, whatever. And like not actually get that the way that this is going to be internalized by the person that we're talking to is only going to take place well or effectively if we're really attending to the deepest yearnings of the person that we're talking to. The key to good evangelism is you connect this truth about the world with the deepest longings in the human heart. Michael Keller distinguishes between bad evangelism and good evangelism. Bad evangelism is, you're wrong, and I'd love to tell you about it. Good evangelism is, I know what you love. And because I know you, I think you're going to love this too. In other words, good evangelism connects that daring, objectively true proclamation about the cross with the deepest loves of the person that we stand before as witnesses. That's where evangelism has its strongest power. You know, I think it's just going to take some fortitude. God gave early Christians the fortitude to speak the full gospel in the face of persecution. I think of my father-in-law. We were just talking with Stuart about my father-in-law, who was a communist spy in Soviet-era Romania and was sent to spy on the Baptists in their revival meeting and take note of who was making decisions, and he wound up making a decision and becoming a Christian, and then had to faced physical threats of physical force and social ostracism. And I think even now though about Christians in the Arab world who have remarkable resilience to bear witness. We just heard from one at the Lausanne Congress just a few weeks ago in Seoul, South Korea. We heard from one pastor who spoke at the previous Lausanne Congress in 2010. And when he got up to speak at this one, he said, well, the last time I spoke at this Congress, when I went home, I was arrested and was in jail for 5 years. I'm hoping it goes better this time. But I mean, the amount, like the way he could even use humor to talk about that experience, it's something astounding to me. I think of Wang Yi, who's still in prison even now since December of 2018, Chinese house church leader who told his church beforehand, test yourself to see if you are crazy for the gospel. When you are threatened with death for the gospel, you find out for whom you really live. When faced with the risk of job loss, you know for whom you really work. When you may lose fortune and position for the sake of the gospel, you find out whether you are crazy for money or crazy for the gospel. Now, we don't face that kind of imminent persecution in the West, but, bearing witness will involve a cost. It always does. I mean, the story of Jesus centers on the cross. Faithfulness to Jesus is going to have a cruciform shape. When we say we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus, well, we must remember what happened to the hands and feet of Jesus. Some measure of suffering is always going to accompany the proclamation of the cross. There's going to be sparks and friction and dissonance. Jesus told us to expect that, but he also told us he would give us courage. One last thing I'll mention on here is we ought to offer testimonies that support but don't supplant the gospel. I'm going to point this out. I don't want to be misunderstood. One of the ways I think evangelism can go astray or can get watered down is if we basically just limit evangelism to just giving our personal testimony. Now listen, do not walk out of here saying, well, Trevin Wax thinks we shouldn't give our testimonies. No, Paul gave his testimony multiple times in Acts. The Samaritan woman ran into town after her conversation with Jesus. The man born blind, after he's healed, goes and tells everyone. I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote Surprised by Joy, right? But you've got to understand our testimonies are secondary to the main event, which is that proclamation of gospel truth. Sometimes people will say, the reason you should evangelize by sharing your testimony is that nobody can argue with your testimony. And to which I say, yes, that's why it's not enough. Let's say I'm sharing my testimony with a stranger and I'm talking about how much Jesus has changed my life, and they're like, that's great. I'm so glad that's worked for you. My foray into Buddhism and to mindfulness apps has really changed my life. Well, then you're just kind of like, oh, well, great. Where do you go from there? My testimony, your testimony. You're back in that privatized, personalized faith only. I'm going to close with this quote. Daniel Nary's memoir of being a refugee from Iran. He's trying to explain the reasons for his mother's conversion from Islam to Christianity. I mean, you got to understand, his mother was a fierce Muslim. She marched for the revolution. She studied the Quran in the way very few people do, but she became a Christian. And when people ask him why she converted, this is his response. He said, I don't have an answer. How can you explain why you believe anything? So I just say what my mom says when people ask her. She looks them in the eye with the begging hope that they'll hear her, and she says, because it's true. Why else would she believe it? It's true. And it's more valuable than $7 million in gold coins and thousands of acres of Persian countryside and 10 years of education to get a medical degree and all your family and a home and even maybe your life. My mom wouldn't have made the trade otherwise. If you believe it's true, that there is a God and he wants you to believe in him and he sent his son to die for you, then it has to take over your whole life. It has to be worth more than everything else because heaven's waiting on the other side. There's no middle. She had all that wealth, the love of all those people she helped in her clinic. They treated her like a queen, and she's poor now. People spit on her in buses. She's a refugee in places people hate refugees. And she'll tell you, it's worth it. Jesus is better. It's true. Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. The whole story hinges on it. So it's true. The story is true. If we give up the public truth of the gospel, if we just settle for the pluralistic confines of a personalized and privatized faith, well, then we'll lose the adventure of Christianity, the adventure of evangelism. We'll lose the heart of Christianity. Live my truth? No. With Jesus, we declare the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the good news. Okay, so thoughts, comments, feedback. What do you all think about this and how it affects our evangelism? Suggestions, things you found helpful as you've in your own life or maybe in the people you lead? I'd love to hear from you guys, what you all think.
This is great. That was awesome.
There's a butt coming there. Yeah.
Not for me, but
Yeah.
I find myself on this journey, right? And going through school and all that, and wrestling with your faith. But people that just come for Sunday, people that just come for one day, people that just hear it and just like, oh, it's for me.
Right.
When you speak that truth, there are going to be people that leave. How are we not? How does the church be okay with that? How are they okay with that? Because when Jesus spoke the truth, people left.
Yeah.
And I think we're scared now that COVID happened and smaller and smaller, when we speak that truth, to be okay with people leaving when they can't handle that.
Yeah. There's a couple things that come to mind when you say that. First, I'm just glad you acknowledge the fact that a lot of the people that come to our congregations are coming to our churches because they think Christianity just sort of helps them in life, gives them a moral foundation, is good for their kids. They want to raise it. And to that, I say, hey, I'm encouraged by that. Like, we should be encouraged that people are in church for any reason, right? Like, you don't be like, you're here for the wrong reason. Go home. Like, who, some people, it gives them a great experience. It makes them connect with something greater. I think of that scene from, Everybody Loves Raymond where, Deborah's trying to explain to Ray why she goes to church, to Mass every week. And she's like, well, because it reminds me that things are bigger than myself and that it connects me to, I want to be grateful for other kids, Amen. I'm glad she's there. All of that is happening. So on the one hand, I just would affirm any reason anyone's at church that what the good news is, the people that are at church, even for the wrong reasons, they're at church. Like, you have a starting point right there to be able to move forward. How do you preach the objective truth of the gospel in a way that people don't leave? Well, there's no way to do that because Jesus had disciples walk away, and it was Jesus. Paul lost Demas, right? Like, you've got there are going to be people that are like, I'm not, I don't believe this anymore, or I'm walking away. The one thing we want to guard against, though, is we want to guard against people walking away for the wrong reason. If someone walks away, if I share the gospel with someone over time, and we get to a point where we take the daring step and it gets, heart rate pounding and all that, and we get to that point and they say no, or I'm not ready, or whatever, it's still a win in the sense that the choice has been put before them. That's what I'm called to do, right? But the only thing is, I don't want them to have rejected the gospel because of something that is not really essential to the gospel, because of my posture or my approach or my the way I preached or the way I spoke or whatnot. But even there, I would simply say a lot of times we're more worried about that than I think we should be, because it's not like the power is in your presentation anyway. Most people get saved in spite of our evangelistic presentations, not because they were brilliant and amazing and crossed every T and dotted every I just perfectly, So, I would say, if you're so worried that if you get to that point in the gospel and someone might say no, what's the alternative? That they don't ever get to that point where the claims of Christ are pressed on them? I think our calling is to try to move there. It's hard. It's really hard, and it's nerve-wracking, and we have to pray and trust that the Spirit's at work, and we may also just be one of the people that God is using to move along someone, and we're not going to be the person that is the final person in a process to be the one to lead them to Jesus, and that's a noble thing as well. So I think we have to lose the fear that we're going to turn people off and be a little, just be focused on making sure if people get turned off and they leave, I want them leaving for the right reasons. I want strategic leavers, not because I said something ridiculous from the pulpit or something like that. That's a great observation. Yes, Stuart.
Related to that, you have watched, and of course you've lived overseas as well, but the whole the triumph of the therapeutic in American and Western culture, and the idea that for most people, emotional gratification is what they mean by truth.
Yes.
So we, as pastors and preachers, are often trying to make people happy. Mm-hmm. And we ourselves, in a seeker-sensitive world, we're reframing the gospel ourselves in our own, because we're not willing to pay the cost of saying truth. So how do you see that? You've got much more experience in the North American church. Do you see that the truthfulness, what you've been saying, the New Beginning type approach and other things, is that being heard more? Is it being said more, embraced more?
Well, this is one out of 4 talks in which there's another where I do a whole thing just on the sort of you, be true to yourself, find happiness way of life. Here's the good news and the bad news, kind of, in what you just described about the triumph of the therapeutic in North American life. It's not working for people. I mean, this is just to show how challenging things have become, because we're having this meaning and purpose and identity crisis that I mentioned here, where people don't know what they're really for, and because everyone has to kind of define and create their own identity. We have this really odd situation where one of the ways that people are finding identity is through their mental maladies. I was reading in the New Yorker just recently about how the DSM, the sort of the Bible for psychiatry, all of the different disorders that are listed there. As psychiatrists do more study and whatnot, they want to remove some of the listings or put them as underneath other listings and psychiatric disorders and things. And they're running into tremendous pressure that they cannot change the DSM or to remove some of those disorders or to put them as subcategories in other disorders, because people have so identified their lives around the disorder. Which creates this perverse incentive that you don't. It's like Jesus asking the man at the pool of Bethesda, "Do you want to be healed?" Because you're finding your identity in not being healed, right? In finding a community of other sufferers. So, and this is a really tricky place to be, because there are real mental maladies and real disorders, and there really are very challenging problems that it is very helpful to know about, and the different ways that we can respond to those, right? So on the one hand, simply even bringing up this conversation brings up the risk of, well, you're just blaming the victim, or you're saying, but the reality is it's not the psychiatric or the psychological thing that is the challenge here. It's the identity crisis that is the problem, that's in leading us to latch on to wherever it is that we find some kind of meaning or significance in our own suffering. And so I think that this is one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing. I mean, you say we live in the triumph of the therapeutic. That's the title from a book by Philip Reef that was, explaining the pervasiveness and the influence of Freud. We all live in Freud's world now to some extent. And I mean, throw in Wilhelm Reich and sexual revolution there as well, but put it all together, and that's a lot of our world. But you'd think in the triumph of the therapeutic, we'd be better off. But we're actually not. We're not. So the good news is, bad news and good news. The bad news and good news is it's not working out for people. And so when we, and the thing is, we do have a different path to happiness than what's on display in sort of a just be true to yourself kind of world that we live in. But it goes through the cross. And so the reality is we're not promising, this is where the prosperity teachers go off course, is that they basically will promise happiness without a cross. And we are saying, no, there is a meaning to your suffering. There is a redemption to your suffering. And so but it's only through the cross and out the other side. So Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. When Jesus tells us to pick up our cross, it's because he has that greater joy on the other side. So what we have to do is we've got to reframe, help our world understand why the world that they're living in isn't working out well for them, and then be able to bring the news of the gospel. And it will get to this part as well, but there are lots of different, I like to say it this way, there's lots of different doors into the people of God. The church has lots of different doors. All of them at some level, to be in, you're crossing the truth threshold. But there are multiple ways conversationally that you're going to be relating to someone before you necessarily arrive at this. Yes.
So it's kind of a intricate, complicated question. So you're talking about the idols that we all face, and an idol in our context is busyness.
Yeah.
And obviously you're familiar with John Comer's book about
Practicing
that.
the way, yeah.
And
Or the ruthless elimination.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so how do you connect the dots of curiosity to speaking the gospel to essentially help teach people not to be so busy? And I'm asking primarily in the youth ministry context, where a lot of my students are doing, 50, 60 plus hours of school and extracurricular stuff, along with their family members.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's several challenges to evangelism we didn't even touch on in this, and one of them is the busyness of just relationally shallow. Like, we don't have deep and enduring relationships because we don't have time. Like, relationships take time, right? Is one reason. Another is we don't know enough non-Christians. In our circle, in church leader circles, that can be the challenge. You become the best evangelists generally are the ones that just became Christians because their friend groups are still not Christians. And so they still have good, sometimes close relationships with people outside the faith. The busyness challenge is a huge one. And it's not just because of sports and events and things like that. It's also because of this. I mean, this is the most self-centering device ever, devised by human ingenuity. Like, everything about this says the world revolves around you. Everything is tailored to you. It's like your world in a magic mirror. And so you put all of that together with the demands on extracurricular. We're going to be on the travel ball team. We're going to do this, that, and there's just very little time for any kind of substantive reflection at all to where people would even see themselves as being an evangelist. So I am encouraged that I do think that there is a bit of a backlash among some younger people on this question. When I go to college campuses or I'm in churches that have lots of university students, I notice a real hunger for like digital detoxing and things like they'll use like fasts and things like that, or they'll have, event. Like I was, my son, when he was a teenager a couple of years ago, was at a meal at a restaurant with some friends, and I was trying to get a hold of him and I couldn't get a hold of him. And I was like, what is going on? It's like, we all put our phones on silent. We had put our phones away, Dad. And I was like, good. We should probably be all doing that, but like they'd all kind of agreed when they went out to the meal, they're going to really be present. I mean, he was a 16-year-old doing that. So I do think there's a hunger among younger people. What's going to be necessary, and this is where we have an opportunity also as a church, is to provide some structure to really some unstructured lives, but structure that builds in, some practices of abiding that are really hard, the nice thing is not just us. I mean, Pascal said like the problems of humanity go back to the fact that we can't sit in a room alone just with our thoughts, And he said that when 1600s, So I'm like, they didn't even have this at that point. They didn't even have the radio back then, So that's a perennial challenge. But I think the hunger is there. The question is, are we going to be able to offer, even from the Christian tradition, some structures, rhythms, habits, and things that will help form those atrophied muscles among our young people? John Mark is an example of someone who's trying to do that. Kyle Strobel at Biola University is another person who's, John Tyson is another one there's some really good practitioners that are trying to help in that spiritual formation way. But yeah, we've got our work cut out for us on that. Yes?
Trevin, is part of what you're saying to Christians who've acted kind of from a classic, these are the, Christ is the truth amongst all truth claims, and this is the truth, you must believe it, that confrontation with pluralism and all that, and kind of saying, look, that it boils down to that rather than, and then we spent a lot of time, in the last, I don't know how long, sort of trying to be out there, making that case, saying, hey, Christ is the truth. And every once in a while, someone will be like, yeah, it's true, and I have to believe it. But that's obviously not the only path to conversion. That's not the way churches necessarily operate.
Right.
So, and I've been involved in this conversation where it got a lot more complicated around where's our starting point in evangelism, things like that, and you didn't even mention postmodernism. It's like, was that a blip that we can just sort of ignore? Like it didn't really dismantle modernism where it's still basically a modern world? That, I don't know, that part of me thinks that is the case, that postmodernism did some damage to modernity, but really we're all just thinkers who are basically just, what do I think? What do you think? And it's still the same game. I don't know.
Well, but postmodernism definitely it levels the playing field in the sense that all truth claims are then suspect, and then you throw in Nietzsche in there, and it's like all are really claims to power, right? So like when you say this is true, it's what you're really wanting is control over this, or it's power, and every group has its own thing. There's a fascinating video essay on the metamodern mood that I think is really interesting in pop culture, which I'm still thinking about it, and it's kind of a mix of both postmodernism and modernism, but like in some pop culture artifacts and movies and TV shows and things that we're seeing right now, it's almost as if it's like they're breaking the fourth wall, and they know what you really want is you want this romance to end this way, and you want the good, happy ending. But we know because postmodernism wants it all to be death, despair, destruction. It can't be real. Don't fall for the sort of modernist, sort of realistic tying a bow on the end of the thing. And so, but the metamodern way will give you the bow you want, but will wink as they do because they know you really want it, and they're giving it to you as well. So it's like this. It's in entertainment anyway. It's just a fascinating look at what is happening. What I would say, you asked about starting point, though. I go back to something that Francis Schaeffer would say when asked, if you were going to share the gospel with someone for an hour, if you had a time, what all would you pack into that hour? And he said something like, I would listen for 50 minutes and then talk for the last 10. Meaning, my starting point is the person and where they're and who they are. And I think part of the way, I don't think we can really get a hearing for the truth conversation until, for most of the time, until we really know well the people that God has put in front of us. And that requires attentive listening. And I don't know about you, but like my wife says, I'm not great at that. Like really attentive listening, carefully listening is not easy for us in our day and age. And so when I think of evangelism in our day beginning with curiosity, it's in part because you're going to have different obstacles and starting points depending on who we're talking to. Part of this is multiculturalism as well. I was talking recently with a church planter friend of mine in Frankfurt, Germany. He is half Korean, half German, but he speaks Thai because he grew up as a missionary kid in Thailand. So it's like, welcome to the 21st century, right? But he's in Frankfurt, and he's a church planter. And he was talking about the agility that you have to have as an evangelist or an apologist in Frankfurt today, because in one day, in the morning, he may have a conversation with a secular German person who he's having to convince that Christianity is not homophobic, bigoted, LGBT hating, whatever. And in the afternoon, he's having a conversation with a Muslim migrant where he's trying to explain that Christianity, truly does teach compassion toward LGBT people. like people who identify this way, like that they have dignity and respect. He's like, the same day, right? Like depending on who you're talking to, because of all the migration and the different cultures right there in Frankfurt. And most pastors are just like, that's almost like a whiplash situation, right? But most pastors are not, haven't thought through the different kinds of tools that will have to be in the tool belt to be able to have conversations with all kinds of different people with all kinds of starting points. So that's why I harped on that curiosity piece first. It's not because I'm saying, hey, put off the truth conversation or let's back away from that. It's simply because I think the world is going to get even more culturally diverse, not less. And if we don't start with curiosity, we're going to be answering questions that people aren't asking or starting from different points that are not resonating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I follow up with this? So one of our pastor here in Atlanta, one of our bigger churches, has a huge heart for evangelism, has really put his main focus in his ministry on evangelism. And so recently he had a talk, he's boiling it down to there's only two miraculous things you have to believe in Christianity: creation and Jesus' resurrection.
Right.
All right. And so it offended some people in his congregation. I thought, well, there's a lot of other things you have to believe in Christianity, whatever. But he's doing it out of a massive heart for trying to get the gospel out, make it clear and kind of boil it down to like, this is the thing, the confrontation. This is it. This is the essence. How do you interact with that approach? I mean, he's coming unapologetically from a very pragmatic standpoint.
Yeah.
But an evangelical, an Orthodox, Christian, pastor, how do you interact with that? I mean, I don't know if that's, if you're.
There's something right in the impulse to not get confused about what the central issues are. Like, do I have to believe in a literal 7-day creation to be a Christian? Well, no, because a lot of Christians don't believe that. But there are some people that will put everything sort of in the box of, you got to believe all this to become a Christian, where it's just like, that's not do I have to believe the Bible's inerrancy? Well, we believe the Bible is inerrant, but that's not the main thing that you're putting in so there's something right about the impulse. But where I think that goes wrong is, it's almost trying to like remove the weirdness of Christianity, whereas I think the weirdness is what makes Christianity compelling. Tom Holland, the historian, talks about, I mean, we had a Keller Center fellows call with him not that long ago, and he was talking about the weirdness of angels and demons and all this stuff, but he was basically telling us all, this is a guy who's like kind of on the border of faith, saying, I think the churches should lean into this. Like, why? Like, the world is hungry for this. Like, why would you not? Why? Like, this is what's compelling. In a world that has flattened everything to naturalistic material forces, this is where you would lean in. So I understand the heart of what the pastor's saying, like trying to, say, hey, I just want to make this the one non-negotiable and remove everything else. But you're not inviting Christianity into just sort of the checking of a doctrinal box. You're inviting them into a world. And I want that world to be as Narnian as possible. So, you know what I mean? So I think that the good intention there backfires a bit, but that's my take on that. Yes.
A lot of this conversation, there's some Tim Keller quote that I can't remember how it goes, but something along the lines of, a lot of times we're so busy trying to force people to see the truth. Really what we ought to do is create a longing in them where they say, wouldn't it be great if this were true?
Yeah.
Right.
Would you want this to be true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot
Keller got that from Pascal, but yeah.
So, the entry points are where would they say, well, that would be great if this was true.
Yeah.
And then you you know,
That's
fill
great.
out, fill out the
Yeah.
picture to the truth, right?
That's exactly what I think evangelism needs to be. I think we're right up on time. Brian, turn it back over to you. Sorry, we got carried away here.
No, you're great. You're great. And I think I love the comment about Francis Schaeffer, just his whole approach with like presuppositional apologetics, like making people go to the bottom of their belief and
Yeah.
stare at it
Yeah.
and say, does this really give you hope? I think it's a great approach. I love the interaction today. Can we thank Trevin for being with us today? Trevin, can I ask you to do this? Can you pray over our ministry here? Thank you.
Lord, I thank you for these men and women, these brothers and sisters who've gathered today. And I thank you for the churches, the ministries that they represent, the people that are touched through their service. And I pray, Father, that you would give us a renewed enthusiasm, a renewed boldness to proclaim the gospel. Give us wisdom, give us skill, guidance, patience with the people that you put before us. And I pray, Father, that you would, in all things, help us to both declare and display your goodness to the world. In Jesus' name, amen.